people in my village have avoided that vast stretch of mangrove forest near the river for decades. I remember my father warning me never to go deeper than where the sunlight could filter through the thick canopy. Every kid here has heard the stories of an evil spirit lurking in those dark, drenched corridors of trees, waiting to lunge at anyone foolish enough to wander too close. To most, the danger is mythical, just a way to keep children away from the saltwater crocodiles. But I'm not writing this to debunk anything. I am old, and my mind is coming apart at the seams. I am writing this as a warning. Never dismiss the remnants of old superstitions. They exist for a reason. There are places in this world where logic does not apply, where the laws of reality are toyed with by forces that defy explanation. The mangrove forest near my village is one of those places. I was only 22 when I first set foot in its treacherous terrain. Decades ago, a boy went missing. It was a brutally hot July day. I was untangling a stubborn fishing net by my boat when Nerina appeared behind me. She was gasping, collapsing at my feet, her light blue dress soaked with mud. "Rihi," she sobbed. "He went into the mangrove forest after school. He hasn't come home." Nerina was a distant relative of my late wife, a quiet woman I had protected from village gossip. Her son, Rihi, was the closest thing I had to a grandson. Fear had hollowed her out. I sat her down, promised to find him, and headed to the village head's house to gather a search party. Among the 20 men who joined me was Hassan, a broad-shouldered marine science student from the city. I despised him instantly. He was loud, vulgar, and mocked the very environment he was there to study. He treated our traditions like jokes and looked at Nerina with a disgusting, predatory grin. As we slipped into the forest, the air thickened. The salty sea breeze died, replaced by the stagnant stench of brackish water and rotting leaves. The ground turned to black mud that sucked at our shoes with a wet, reluctant sound. Mangrove roots pushed up like black spikes, forcing us to watch every step. The deeper we went, the colder it became. Hassan stayed close to me, blowing cigarette smoke and making crude remarks about Nerina, asking if a widow like her would go for a city guy like him. I stayed silent, my jaw tightening, struggling not to let the forest take my focus. We pushed through knotted masses of roots that looked like dark, knobbly bones. The forest grew dimmer, the light filtering down in thin, broken shafts. As I walked, my mind involuntarily slipped back 60 years, to a night of gunfire and cruelty. I remembered being dragged along a muddy riverbank by a soldier named Sato, my hair gripped in his fist. My bare feet had been sliced open by jagged barnacles, my blood mixing with the slick mud. I remembered the sound of his gleaming sword, the same sword that had beheaded my cousin weeks earlier. That night, 60 years ago, I had lost the desire to live. But as we sat in the dark swamp back then, watching the soldiers' lanterns flicker, a primitive instinct for survival had sparked in my battered body. Now, decades later, I was back in that same darkness, searching for a boy who had no idea that some shadows don't just hide predators. They hide things that shouldn't exist at all. The search party began to spread out, though no one dared to move too far from the group's center. The deeper we pushed, the more the mangrove forest seemed to change its character. The trees here didn't just grow. They twisted around one another in suffocating spirals, their bark feeling like cold, damp skin under my touch. Hassan's loud laughter had finally died down, replaced by a heavy, frequent checking of his watch. He kept complaining that his GPS was glitching, the needle spinning aimlessly as if the magnetic poles had decided to play a trick on us. I noticed the village boys were no longer jumping into the mud. They were looking over their shoulders, their eyes darting toward the thickets every time a branch creaked. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a predatory one, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. We found the first sign of Rihi near a cluster of breathing roots that stuck out like rusted nails. It was a small plastic whistle he always wore around his neck, half buried in the silt. There were no footprints leading away from it, only a strange, wide drag mark that disappeared into a wall of impenetrable thorns. By the second hour, the light had turned a sickly, bruised purple. The canopy above was so dense that it felt like we were walking through a tunnel underground. We reached the edge of the forbidden river, the Black Vein, as the elders called it. The water didn't flow. It sat there, dark and oily, reflecting nothing. Hassan tried to shine his high-powered flashlight across the bank, but the beam seemed to get swallowed by the mist halfway across. "The kid must have crossed," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. I looked at the mud near the bank and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. There were tracks, but they weren't human. They looked like the prints of a massive bird. Yet the weight required to sink them that deep into the hardened clay suggested something much heavier. One of the village men, a seasoned fisherman named Bari, refused to go further. He pointed at a tree nearby. Hanging from the lower branches were small, intricate dolls made of woven grass and human hair. Old protection charms. They were freshly made, still green, and they were all facing us, as if warning us that we were the intruders in a territory that had already claimed its prize. As we crossed the shallowest part of the river, the mist rose to our waist. It was thick and smelled of old copper and rotting lilies. Suddenly, the group was cut in half by a sudden, dense fog that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I could hear the men calling out to one another, but their voices sounded miles away, distorted by the humidity. I found myself walking alongside Hassan, who was now visibly trembling. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, gripping his flashlight like a club. I listened. It wasn't the wind or the insects. It was a voice, thin, high-pitched, and unmistakably Rihi's. It was calling for his mother, but the sound wasn't coming from one direction. It was bouncing off the trees, circling us. Hassan began to run toward the sound, ignoring my warnings. I struggled to keep up, my old joints screaming in protest as my feet slipped on the mossy roots. When I finally caught up to him, he was standing frozen in a small clearing. His flashlight was lying on the ground, the lens cracked. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, small and hunched, with its back to us. It wore Rihi's yellow shirt, but the way its shoulders moved, twitching with a rhythmic, mechanical jerk, didn't look like any child I had ever known. "Rihi," Hassan called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't turn. It began to hum a lullaby that Narina used to sing, but the pitch was wrong, vibrating with a metallic resonance that made my teeth ache. I reached out to grab Hassan's arm, sensing the trap, but he was already moving forward. As he stepped into the circle of light, the figure finally turned around. It wasn't Rihi. It was a hollowed-out shell, a construct of mud and mangrove vines fashioned into the likeness of a boy. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two polished black stones that seemed to drink in the light. The mouth opened, and the boy's voice came out again, but this time it was joined by a second voice, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the earth itself. The mud creature collapsed into a heap of sludge, and from the shadows behind it, something moved. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that moved like the shifting roots of the trees. It didn't walk. It flowed through the darkness. Before we could scream, a massive, pale hand reached out from the canopy above and plucked the man standing behind us straight into the air without a single sound. Panic finally broke the search party. Men who had spent their lives facing the fury of the ocean turned and fled into the darkness. But the forest had changed. The paths we had taken to get here were gone, replaced by a wall of thorns and shifting silt. I found myself separated from everyone except Hassan, who was now hyperventilating, his city logic completely shattered. We stumbled into a part of the forest where the trees grew in perfect, haunting circles. In the center of each circle lay a pile of bones, mostly animals but some too large, too straight to be anything but human. The air here was so cold our breath came out in white plumes. I realized then that the evil spirit the elders spoke of wasn't just a ghost. It was the forest itself, a living, sentient entity that fed on the fear and the bodies of those who lost their way. We heard a scream from the distance, Bari's voice, followed by a sickening crunch that ended abruptly. The shadows around us began to lengthen, stretching toward our feet like reaching fingers. I knew if we stayed still, the ground would swallow us just as it had swallowed the missing boy.